Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Mason. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of President Lincoln's Cottage, and I was just pointing out to my colleagues that as of yesterday, I have been part of the team at President Lincoln's Cottage for 4 months. It's a huge honor for me to be part of the team. Many of you in the audience tonight have been supporting the Cottage for much longer than I have, and I just want to say thank you to all of our members who have joined us tonight, all of our major donors, and we're supposed to have three former board members with us tonight: Candy Hooper, Susan Fatt, and Matthew Watkins. And I just want to acknowledge their active leadership in keeping the Cottage alive and well, really. So I'd also like to thank Joan Cummins and Michelle Easley for their efforts to make this wonderful event come together. So with that, I will move on to talking about Jonathan White. At President Lincoln's Cottage, we're all about revealing the life and legacy of the real Abraham Lincoln to inspire the struggle for freedom today in all areas of life. As our podcast Q&A states so eloquently, we're storytellers, we're historians, and we're truth seekers. To explore Lincoln's life and legacy, we often welcome scholars who have special insight into the 16th president. And tonight is one of those nights. Jonathan White is a professor at Christopher Newport University. He has a PhD in US history from the University of Maryland. He's authored 10 books and more than 100 articles. So we're really with an expert tonight, and an expert who is deeply engaged with the Cottage, for which we're grateful. Tonight we'll be talking about his book, House Built by Slaves, African-American Visitors to the Lincoln White House. It's based on an impressive array of primary sources, and it really provides a compelling picture of the ways in which Lincoln's attitudes and behaviors changed American life. So I want to welcome you, John. It's really fabulous to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
As we start off, I was fortunate enough to read your interview in The Guardian, and I think it would be really interesting for most people. I find that the folks who don't work in this space are really interested in the process by which academics and other professionals find their passions. So I'm curious about how you came to focus your research on Lincoln in general, and really what compelled you to write this book.
Yeah, I've always loved history, and part of that was growing up in a house from the 1720s outside of Philadelphia and finding the old trash pit and digging up old artifacts. And I think that sort of material culture is what gave me a love of history and the Civil War in particular. And I got to college as a business major, but then very quickly realized I needed to go a different path. And so it's taken me down this road. And I initially thought of myself as a Civil War historian, but then about 10 or 12 years ago, I wrote a book about Abraham Lincoln and civil liberties. And it explores this issue of the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, arresting political dissenters, and military trials of civilians and so forth, things that are still have been relevant in our lifetimes. And I think writing that book is what really brought me into the Lincoln fraternity. And I have fond memories actually of being in graduate school at the University of Maryland, living on Capitol Hill and going out to the Lincoln Cottage for events. And so it really is a thrill then to be able to do these sort of things with you. As for this book, starting around 2014, I started collecting as many letters from African Americans to Lincoln as I could find. And my original conception for a book was to do something called emphatically the Black Man's President, African American Correspondence and Conversations with Abraham Lincoln. I ultimately found about 125 letters. And there was just so much there that I realized I had to break the correspondence away from the conversations. And so In October, I published a book called To Address You as My Friend, African Americans' Letters to Abraham Lincoln. And that consists of the correspondence side of the research. And then just a few days ago on Lincoln's birthday, I was able to publish this narrative history of Black visitors to the Lincoln White House.
So as I said to you before we went live with all of our visitors tonight, I really enjoyed the book. And I must say, I found the title a little bit misleading. You know, you cover so much more than just African-American visitors to the White House.
Yeah.
You ended up detailing Lincoln's relationship with African-Americans across his whole life, and
Right.
with various leaders of the African-American communities in different places. The picture that you paint of Lincoln as a shrewd leader with a genuine interest in the well-being of all American citizens, I found really compelling. I wonder if you could share with us how you see the impact of Lincoln's engagement with African-American individuals and institutions over the course of his presidency.
Yeah, it's a great question. And as an aside, I thought you were going to say you found the main part of the title misleading. I wanted to call the book In a House Built by Slaves, because it's about, and the title, for those who don't know, but most probably do, comes from First Lady Michelle Obama's 2016 DNC speech, where she talks about the story of America from slavery to civil rights. And she said, so that every morning I wake up in a house that was built by slaves. And so I wanted to tell the story of what happened in that house. And the Barnes and Noble rep said, well, we don't like the word in. And so they took out the word in, and someone wrote to me and they said, I thought it was going to be an architectural history about the building. I didn't expect it to be what it was. So sorry, that was just a little bit of an aside. But yeah, so Lincoln grew up his earliest years in Kentucky, which was a slave state. His family, when he's a boy, moves to Indiana, which is a free state. And then when he's close to 21, he moves to Illinois, another free state that does have some forms of unfree labor in it. And by the time he's an adult in Springfield, Illinois, he is living in what some people would consider an integrated neighborhood. So there are Black servants, there are African Americans who live in the neighborhood, who work in his home or who work in the community. He has some Black law clients in his law practice. So he is interacting with African Americans, but not on a large scale, I don't think. But that changes when he gets to Washington, D.C. He brings some Black servants with him from Illinois to Washington. And then from the very beginning of his presidency, he is interacting with African Americans. One of the earliest interactions he has is with a man named Nicholas Biddle, who was from Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, which is kind of the south central part of the state. And Biddle had been part of this contingent of soldiers who went from Pennsylvania down to Baltimore and then to Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the Civil War. Now, Biddle was not a soldier himself because the federal government was not allowing Black enlistment, but he was wearing a uniform. He's going as the servant of an officer of a Pennsylvania regiment. And as they're passing through Baltimore in April of 1861, a mob rises up and they throw bricks and rocks and all sorts of things at the soldiers and yell N-word in uniform. And Nicholas Biddle gets hit in the face by a brick or a stone. And he's very badly wounded. And he and the soldiers make their way to Washington, D.C., and they are camped out in the Capitol building. And I love to think about the Capitol building as like a bivouac for Union soldiers. And Lincoln and some cabinet members go to the Capitol to greet these soldiers, and Lincoln goes around and shakes all of their hands. And one of the hands that he shakes is Nicholas Biddle. And he doesn't treat Biddle any differently because of the color of his skin. And that, I think, is one of the first interactions Lincoln has with an African-American as president in Washington, D.C. It's going to be a year until African-Americans begin going to the White House to meet with the president. But even in that interim period, he's going around Washington and meeting with people who are working as assisting nurses in hospitals and fugitives who are running to Washington for protection from their owners in Virginia or Maryland. So very early on in his presidency, he begins meeting African Americans in significant numbers. And by all accounts, he always treats them with dignity and respect and never treats them differently because of the color of their skin, which was really unusual in that era. And one of the things we would often think today is, well, he's an anti-slavery guy. You know, wouldn't we expect reformers and abolitionists and anti-slavery activists, politicians like Lincoln to be welcoming to the people they claim to be fighting for? And the reality is, even among abolitionists and reformers, there was an incredible amount of prejudice. In the book, I talk about cases where people who are really quite famous today as abolitionists and reformers refused to shake the hands of African Americans. And that was never an issue with Lincoln.
So I was really intrigued by Lincoln's friendship with William de Fleurville, and I wonder if you talk some about that. I just think it was a part of his history that was new to me. And to be clear, I am not a Lincoln scholar by training, so that shouldn't surprise anybody. But I thought that this very intimate friendship that he had in Illinois was really intriguing.
Yeah. So Fleurville was a Haitian immigrant who moved to the United States as a young man. He, I think, first went to New Orleans and then Baltimore, and then for some reason decided he wanted to settle in Springfield, Illinois. And the story that comes down to us from one of those old county histories of the late 19th century, and so you got to take it for what it is. It's a story written 20, 30 years after Lincoln's assassination. But the story that comes down to us is that one day in this small little village of New Salem, Illinois, Williamfleurville, this Haitian immigrant, is walking, through the village on his way to Springfield, and he meets this sort of gangly, tall, lanky guy wearing a plaid shirt, and that guy says, well, why don't you come back with me and stay the night so you have a place to have dinner and to sleep tonight before you make your way onto Springfield. And of course, that young man in 1831 is a very young Abraham Lincoln. And Fleurville makes his way to Springfield. And then about 6 years later, Lincoln moves to Springfield. And they, by all accounts, were friends with one another in Springfield. Lincoln represented Fleurville as a lawyer, did his taxes for him, took care of some property issues. Fleurville became a very wealthy and prominent citizen in the community. So he had a lot of property in Springfield and other places, and Lincoln is helping to handle that for him. And Lincoln gets his hair cut by Billy the Barber. That's what he's known as, Billy the Barber. And they're close to one another during this period leading up to Lincoln's presidency. Lincoln then gets elected and goes to Washington, D.C. And on December 27th, 1863, Fleurville sends just a beautiful, touching letter to his old friend, Lincoln. And Fleurville thanks him for the Emancipation Proclamation. He says he hopes Lincoln will be reelected the following year in 1864. He sends his condolences because Lincoln's son, Willie, had died in February of 1862. He lets Lincoln know how his dog is doing. Lincoln had a dog named Fido back in Springfield. He didn't take the dog with him. He left the dog with the Rawls family. And Fleurville let Lincoln know the dog is doing okay with the Rawlses. And then he let Lincoln know that the boarders who were renting his house were taking good care of it. They didn't have any kids who would be destroying the place, like the Lincoln kids would have done. And so, it's just this really touching letter that he wrote to Lincoln, and Lincoln retained it in his personal papers. It's now at the Library of Congress with the papers that Lincoln didn't kind of send out through the federal bureaucracy. And after Lincoln died, Fleurville was invited to walk at the front of the procession in Springfield, the funeral procession. He instead chose to stay at the back of the procession with the Black community of Springfield. He wanted to show his solidarity with the Black community. But there's a obituary that came out after Fleurville died, where it said there were two men who knew Abraham Lincoln intimately. One was his law partner, Billy Herndon, and the other was his friend, Billy the Barber. So it's a really touching story. In the book that I have over my shoulder there, the one that came out in October, that's the collection of correspondence. And the first letter that I reproduce is that letter from Williamfleurville.
Yeah, it's such a touching story, and so surprising for that time period, as you said.
Yeah.
at the risk of staying at the beginning, I have to say, I'm going to ask you to reflect on another complicated historical incident. I'm a scholar of African religious traditions in the Americas, and so I was excited to learn that Lincoln may well have met with a voodoo priestess in New Orleans in 1831, and that she is alleged to have prophesied that he would be president.
Right.
Can you share more details of that story and help us understand the challenges in documenting it?
Yeah, sure. So Lincoln made two flatboat trips to New Orleans, one in 1828 and one in 1831. And these were big deals for him. He's a young man, at first a minor, and then actually, I guess a minor in both. And he goes to New Orleans, and this is where he first sees slavery on in sort of like all its ugliness. He sees the slave trading that's being done in New Orleans. New Orleans is, of course, a huge slave trading hub in the United States in the antebellum period. According to some accounts, he sees young girls who are stripped down, whose skin is very light, and that bothers him. There's a quote that comes down to us where he is alleged to have said, let's get out of here, boys. Someday I'm going to hit that thing and hit it hard, by which it meant slavery. And that quote comes down to us from a reminiscence from 1865 or 66 from someone who didn't make it all the way to New Orleans with Lincoln. And so since the mid 20th century, people have really called into question that quote, whether or not Lincoln said it. And it's hard to know for sure with these kind of records. There's the quote that went to Lincoln's law partner by someone who had said to have heard it from Lincoln. And then Lincoln's law partner also claimed to have heard it from Lincoln. So it may be that he said it, we just don't know. Then another story that comes out of this is that they, again, go to this sort of voodoo, person who predicts that Lincoln will become president. And I'd have to check my footnote. I forget the source. I think that came from a memoir that was published after Lincoln's death. And so this is the thing that's really hard about the Lincoln story. And that is, I have trouble remembering what I did yesterday. Like, I can't remember what happened a month ago. But after Lincoln dies, people start recounting all these stories about Lincoln that took place 30 or 40 years before. And they can remember verbatim the conversations they had with Abe 2 or 3 decades before Lincoln's presidency. And they somehow knew that he would become this great president then. And so they remembered things. And, as the historian, you have to be very careful with the evidence. And so one of the things I try to do in this book, and a lot of times it's in the footnotes because I didn't want to bog down the narrative, but is give a sense of, okay, we know certain things about Lincoln because of the evidence that was written in the moment. And then some of these things are stories that come down after the fact. And when you use those stories that come down after the fact, what you often try to do is find corroborating evidence. And my recollection of the voodoo story is that the person, it might have even been in something by Hearn, I can't remember now, but that the person who wrote about it said, I couldn't find any corroborating evidence for this story, but I don't know, I think I still included it because it's a heck of a story. And with the sort of caveat of, we can't really know for sure because who knows, the evidence is just so thin. There are some scholars who don't use any recollected testimony about Lincoln's early life. There are other scholars who use it extensively. My approach is to try to take something of a middle ground and use things where I can, but then be very upfront about the quality of the testimony, I guess.
I think that comes across in the text in this case for what that's worth.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
It just was intriguing to me because it was a story I'd never heard and is related to some of my interests. The The book does a fabulous job of focusing on Lincoln's interactions with African Americans, and it also charts the evolution of his thinking on emancipation and the rights of African Americans. Can you describe that arc and the impact of Lincoln's meetings with African Americans on it?
Yeah. So one of the things we often forget, I'll kind of get to the rights question and then the emancipation question. One of the things we often forget is that Black men could vote in most of the states at the very founding of our nation. So between 1776 and 1787, most of the restrictions on suffrage in this country had to do with property and not with race. And so Black men with property could vote just in the same way that Black men or white men with property could. That right to vote is taken away from African-American men in the 1820s and 30s and so forth in Jacksonian America. And this was being debated around the country. And in the 1830s and 40s, Lincoln actually came out very publicly mocking the idea of Black men voting. And that's going to be his position. He's going to oppose Black suffrage. He's going to oppose Black political rights. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he very famously says, I'm not in favor, never have been, of making the Negro into a juror or a voter or, serving in the militia, that sort of thing. And that's his position in the lead up to the war. At the same time, Lincoln believes slavery is a moral evil. He has always believed slavery is morally wrong. He believes it's protected by the Constitution in the states that have laws protecting slavery, but he also believes that it can be banned from the territories and from the District of Columbia, and that he can attack slavery in peripheral ways. So he becomes president, and in his inaugural address, March 4th, 1861, he essentially takes these positions. I'm not going to touch slavery where it exists. I am going to try to stop its spread into the new territories. And he says he will even enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, although he calls for that act to be amended so that it has what he calls civilized and humane principles embodied in it. Now, Frederick Douglass hears or reads this speech and is infuriated by it. He calls Lincoln the South's greatest slave hound and abolitionism's worst enemy. From Douglass's perspective, Lincoln is just a pro-slavery guy who's going to be a disappointment. But things change during the course of the war. From the very beginning, Lincoln begins attacking slavery on the periphery. So May of 1861, he sets his cabinet on destroying the illegal transatlantic slave trade. He tries to get the border states to end slavery by offering to them compensation and proposing colonization. And his idea there is, again, slavery is protected in those states, but if he can persuade the state legislatures to abolish slavery, then it'll be the states doing it themselves. So he tries to give them federal money to do that. The state legislatures will never go for that, though. By 1862, he and Congress have abolished slavery in Washington, D.C. They've made it illegal for the U.S. Army to return fugitive slaves. And then by the summer, Lincoln decides that an Emancipation Proclamation is the way to go. And his argument is that this is a military measure that is made necessary by the war effort, that the best way to win the war and to save the Union is to destroy slavery. You take away that labor source from the Confederates, you bring them into Union lines and make Black men Union soldiers, and it's a double whammy against the Confederate war effort. And so all along, he is doing things to try to strike at slavery, but now finally in mid-1862, he has taken a position that a year earlier he said was unconstitutional. Now, what role do African Americans play in this transformation, and then in the transformation to the fight for political rights? Well, Black people are pushing for emancipation very early in the war, and they are in speeches and editorials, they're pushing for Lincoln to issue some sort of Emancipation Proclamation. In April of 1862, when that bill from Congress is sitting on his desk, I think the first documented visit to the Lincoln White House from an African American is a bishop named Daniel Payne from the AME Church. He comes to the White House, he meets with Lincoln for 45 minutes and says, you got to sign this bill. And Lincoln won't commit in that moment, although I think Lincoln at that point was pretty certain he was going to sign it. Later that year, in August of 1862, Lincoln is about to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. A former slave named Robert Smalls comes to the White House and meets with Lincoln. And Smalls had very daringly and bravely escaped from bondage by stealing a Confederate ship and taking it out of Charleston Harbor into the Union blockading lines. And Smalls must have told Lincoln his story. And Lincoln, up to that point, had opposed arming Black men because, in part, he feared they would be cowardly. But now Lincoln heard the story firsthand of a brave man who had seized freedom for himself and his wife and his children and about a dozen other slaves. And Smalls went back to Beaufort, South Carolina, carrying a letter from the War Department that authorized the arming of Black soldiers. So I think there, Lincoln, a Black visitor, has a very real impact on Lincoln's thinking. In the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln will then officially say Black men can join the Union forces. And then one thing we can get to later, if you want, with the issue of Black rights, is that in 1864, at least 3 delegations of African Americans come from the South to meet with Lincoln and push him. Now that we are serving in the Army, we should have the right to vote. And I think they had a very tangible effect on his thinking, so that he does a full 180 from mocking Black suffrage as a young man, opposing it as an adult, and then coming out to support it at the very end of his life.
It really is a remarkable transformation in such a public one. It really stands out. You brought up the kind of moral conviction that Lincoln had, that slavery was evil, and part of what you do in the book in an elegant, if understated way, I think, is to recount that evolving conviction that God is in favor of emancipation, which I must say, as a modern American, I have trouble actually saying. But what were the key moments in this emerging conviction, and was there a special role that African American religious leaders played in this process?
Yeah. Lincoln, as a young man, had been what you might call it, what they called at the time, a scoffer of religion, and some accused him of being an infidel. When he ran for Congress in 1845-46, he had to issue a handbill saying, "No, I'm not an infidel. I'm okay to vote for." Because in that culture, if you were anti-Christian, that could be a death sentence for someone who has political aspirations. And he was running against a Methodist minister. So from a very early age into his adulthood, he's reading a lot of Enlightenment thinkers and some skeptics and so forth, and he's very influenced by them. But I do think there's a change in his thinking on the role of God in the world that takes place during the Civil War. It's kind of the old aphorism, there's no atheists in foxholes, right? Lincoln is presiding as president over this incredible national bloodletting, and he's trying to make sense of it and find meaning in it and understand what is happening here. And he sees Northern ministers who are abolitionists saying God wills that slavery be destroyed. And he sees Southern ministers who read the same Bible and pray to the same God and say, no, God wills that slavery be preserved. Slavery is a biblical moral institution. And so Lincoln is surrounded by all these different voices. And I think that in conjunction with all of the inner wrestling and turmoil he's experiencing during the war, including, as I mentioned before, the death of a second son that he would lose, I think he begins to look outside of himself to try to make sense of what's going on. And so he meets with several African Americans in the White House, and they talk about the meaning of emancipation and how it's come about. And he very explicitly says to them, don't praise me. I don't deserve the praise for this. This was God's will. Like, I couldn't have pulled this off. In essence, God has willed this to happen. And I would never say that I think he became what we would today call a born again Christian or something like that. But I do think that he had a profound change in his views about faith as a result of the war. And you see them stated most explicitly in some of these conversations with African Americans. It's interesting. I did not include this in the book. I probably should have. In September of 1862, a group of white ministers from Chicago come to the White House and they push Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Now, that morning, he had an accident with a horse and had sprained his wrist, and he was probably in a little bit of a foul mood. And he really snaps at these ministers. And he's like, you're telling me God's will is this. If God wanted me to know something so badly, I wish he would just tell me himself. Like, he's very flippant towards these people. And it's funny to read in hindsight. Lincoln never, when the subject of God and the Bible and God's will comes up with African Americans, he never treats it that way. And you get a sense that there's a very real spiritual connection that I think he has with his Black visitors. You see it in the White House. And then you mentioned in your first question, which I never actually really got to other than Nicholas Biddle, you see it when he travels around Washington, D.C. He goes out to the soldiers' home. And on his way, he stops at the contraband camp, which was where Howard University, or near where Howard University is now. So it's right on the way. And there are accounts that come down to us of him singing with these Black refugees, tears pouring down his eyes. Imagine Abraham Lincoln singing hymns at the top of his lungs. But again, it was that very real spiritual connection I think he had with African Americans that he met.
It's interesting that you started talking about this. I mean, I was really taken by that chapter because it really does such a wonderful job of showing all of these interactions, from servants to indigent people on the street in front of the White House. It talks about William Slade, who of course worked at both the White House and the Cottage, at the contraband people in the contraband camps. You really do paint a picture of a person who's genuinely interested in the well-being of the people around him. Do you have another favorite story from that chapter?
Yeah, there's one that I love, and it's actually from pretty early in the war. It's from May of 1862, where Lincoln goes to a hospital and to visit with the soldiers. And this was something that he would do regularly. And if, for viewers who've seen the Lincoln movie, it gets depicted really beautifully in that movie with one factual error. He greets a soldier named Kevin, and Kevin apparently wasn't a name in the 1860s that people had in the United States. But other than that, it's really a beautifully done scene in the film. And so one of the scenes I write about in my book is he goes to a hospital in Washington, D.C., and he meets the Black cooks. And these are men and women who have come out of bondage. And he goes and shakes their hands, and he greets them and asks them their first name, and they tell him, and he greets them with their first name. And the nurse who wrote this down, the white nurse who witnessed this, then described the white convalescing soldiers who are watching, and they're furious. The president of the United States is treating people of color this way. And this is the thing that I think is just so important. We talked about sources earlier. There are so many sources, both from the war years and after, that capture this aspect of Lincoln's genuine interaction with people. He was not putting on a show. He was not doing it for the cameras. I got asked a question once, wasn't Lincoln doing this because it made him look good? And it's like, no. In that era, treating African Americans with dignity was not a winning political position to take. And Frederick Douglass, of all people, recognizes. Douglass at one point said it was just so remarkable that Lincoln was so welcoming to African Americans, because he said nothing was more certain to cause white voters to be angry with the president. And so I finding all these stories from so many different sources, I think really gave me such an appreciation for Lincoln's genuine humility and how he's interacting with just ordinary people who in many cases are in very down and out situations, and he can't do everything for them. I mean, I'd be lying if I said he solved everyone's problems, but he at least always did what he could and treated people with dignity and respect.
So just as an aside, I drive by where we think the Mount Pleasant Hospital was on my way to work at the Cottage every day.
Oh yeah.
and think about those moments. It's really, it's very powerful. You brought up the notion of doing it for the cameras, or doing it for media attention, and there is, of course, a series of meetings that have fueled the scholarly arguments that Lincoln was condescending and manipulative in his interactions. And it seems important to share that story.
Sure.
Can you speak to your understanding of his motivations for that famous meeting, that famous meeting with representatives of the African-American community in DC in 1862?
Yeah, so this is August of 1862. And the background is, in June and July, Lincoln decides he's going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. July 22nd, he calls his cabinet together and he says, I'm going to do this. And William Seward cautions Lincoln, the war has been going very badly. If you issue an Emancipation Proclamation, then it'll look like an act of desperation to France and England, and they might then recognize the Confederacy. And so Seward cautions Lincoln, wait until you have a victory on the battlefield and then do it. Then it doesn't look like an act of weakness and desperation. So Lincoln waits. August rolls around. There's a huge loss at Manassas. Victory doesn't come till September 17th. In the meantime, he does several things to try to prepare the American electorate for emancipation. He knows he's going to issue a proclamation, but the vast majority of the American people don't know. And so one of the things he does is he issues a famous letter to Horace Greeley where he says, my paramount object in this war is to save the Union and is not either to save or destroy slavery. And that letter gets very often taken out of context to paint Lincoln in an unflattering light. And then the other moment is on August 14th, 1862, Lincoln has his commissioner of emigration, a guy named James Mitchell, go to the Black community in Washington and say, the president wants to meet with you. And so they elect 5 representatives to go to the White House to meet with Lincoln. And Lincoln lectures them for an hour, blames the presence of Black people as the cause of the war, rather than blaming slavery as the cause of the war, and says, you're never going to be treated equally here. Wherever you go in the United States, white people are just never going to treat you equally. You should go somewhere else like Panama, where you can get good jobs working in coal mines and you'll be treated equally there. I'll do what I can for you. Now, this meeting gets highlighted a lot, and it needs to be discussed. I have a chapter and a half on it in the book because I'm not going to run away from the evidence that needs to be grappled with. There are some scholars who only focus on this meeting and they don't mention any of the other stuff. I think it's important to kind of bring these together. Now, there was really important political context. And again, Lincoln is trying to persuade white Northerners, when emancipation comes, you don't need to be afraid of it. If you're an Irish immigrant in New York City and you're thinking about emancipation, what's your fear? Well, the slaves are going to become free. They're going to move to New York. They're going to take all the jobs and drive wages down. So if you're an Irish immigrant, you don't want emancipation. If you're in the Midwest where it's lily white, you don't want emancipation. You don't want an influx of former slaves. And so Lincoln actually brought a stenographer into the room for this meeting to write down everything he said so that it would get broadcast to the American public, so the white American public, so that he was basically saying to them, look, emancipation's coming, but you don't need to be as worried about it as you might be, because I'm going to try to push this colonization thing. Now, in the book, I think I call it, one of the most unfortunate, regrettable, that's the word I use, one of the most regrettable moments of Lincoln's presidency. As a Lincoln guy, it's like, man, you wish he hadn't done this. But it can at least be understood that he had a strategy in doing it. And one of the things that I write about in the book is that I think right after that meeting, he called a Black minister named Henry McNeil Turner to the White House. And Turner then wrote an article for the Christian Recorder, where Turner really hints that Lincoln had said to him, you don't need to worry about this. Like, it's not going to go anywhere. According to Turner, Lincoln said, I need somewhere to point to. In other words, I need to kind of misdirect and get people thinking about one thing so that I can do something else. And look, Lincoln believed in colonization. I'm not going to say he didn't. He tried it. He tried it several times. And after it finally failed, it, you know, by 1863 or 64, I think he gave up on the idea. He clung to it longer than he should have. But my beef is with people who kind of take this one meeting and hold it out as exemplary of Lincoln's interactions with African Americans. And I think it's not. But I will say one more thing about it. Lincoln shook all of their hands when they came to the White House. He actually persuaded the leader of the meeting, like, hey, this is a good idea, which is amazing to me. Not amazing in like the great way, but just kind of shocking. And if you look at the Democratic press, they look at this meeting and they are aghast that Lincoln, in their mind, has treated Black people as equals by giving them an audience at the White House. It's crazy from a 21st century perspective, but in their mind, the fact that he just invited them for the first time, inviting a Black delegation to the White House, was just beyond the pale. And I call one of those chapters "A spectacle as humiliating as it was," now I'm blanking on the full quote, but William Lloyd Garrison really captured it. He called it "A spectacle as humiliating as it was extraordinary, or extraordinary as it was humiliating." Garrison captured this really complex moment. It's extraordinary that the president is welcoming them to the White House. The way he acted was humiliating, but it's a really interesting and complex moment.
Yeah, thanks for exploring that. I mean, I think the book does a terrific job of contextualizing that that one unfortunate moment. And of course, if we're going to be objective, he could have done it in other ways, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he could have written to a newspaper. Right. He was, after all, the president of the United States.
Yeah, I don't have it's one thing I've thought about. I don't have an explanation for that. Someone actually raised that question to me last week, and they said, why didn't he do it another way? And I don't know. I mean, maybe he wanted to make a statement by inviting Black people. I mean, here's one thing. Some people say today Lincoln wanted to deport African Americans, and it was never deportation. It was never forcible. It was always voluntary. So maybe he was speaking to the Black community in that moment as well, by saying, look, I'm trying to persuade Black leaders to adopt this position. And so there's a message to white racist voters. There's a message to freed people and free African Americans. And that could be why he did it that way.
And certainly at the Cottage, we spend a lot of time talking about Lincoln as a human character, and with moods and, yeah, yes, you said good days and bad days.
You sprain your wrist, you're going to be in a bad mood.
It's very possible that he was uncomfortable and was sort of overcompensated, right? I mean, it seems to me that most accomplished adults have done that once or twice.
Yeah. The other thing I've thought about since the book came out, Lincoln actually lectured a lot of delegations of white people in really rude ways. Like, if you look through the Lincoln corpus, like the Christian ministers that I mentioned from Chicago, I mean, he's just lecturing. You could tell he's ticked off at them, and he lets them know. So it's actually not as unusual, thinking about Lincoln in a broader sense, that he does groups of people come in and meet with him, and he'll talk at them for 45 minutes.
So I have one last question, and forgive me if it seems unfair, but as I said, we do spend a lot of time exploring Lincoln's character with our visitors and posing questions about the lessons that they take from the stories we share about him. You've had the luxury of spending an enormous amount of time delving into this history and really looking at and contemplating Lincoln's interactions with African Americans at the White House and beyond the White House. So taken together, I guess I'm curious, what this history tells you about Lincoln's character.
Yeah. So one of the things I always try to do in my classes is what you all do at the Cottage, and that is humanize Lincoln. On the first day of class, every fall semester, I walk into class without introducing myself. I launch into a 45-minute lecture on the early life of Abraham Lincoln, and I tell them about his love life and the loss of parents and brothers and sister and all this stuff, how he almost was in a duel, how he may have visited a prostitute, like all these stories that they've never heard. And then I put on the screen an image of the Lincoln Memorial. And I stop and I say to the students, when you think about Lincoln, if you ever think about him, this is what you think of: this giant, larger than life statue, this icon who's not a human being. And then I say, I've brought you up to the point in his life when he delivered a speech called the Lyceum Address in 1838. And I said, when you read this for next class, because my students always do the reading, when you read this for next class, I want you to think about Lincoln not as, this giant, greatest president of all time, but as a real person. And I want you to read it in light of everything going on in his life. I mean, he has just gone through a very traumatic loss of his fiance, essentially. Like, he's had some really hard knocks at this point. And so what I try to do in the book is to humanize him. And I want people to see the interactions. I try to use as many words from the time as I could, words from the visitors when they wrote them down, so that I wanted people to feel like they're walking into the White House and have a sense of what his office looked like, and the sights and the things going on. And I'm not a novelist. I mean, I did my best. Well, I don't know, readers will let me know what they think of it. At the same time, though, I think there's something, I try to convey this, that there's something different about Lincoln than the ordinary white person of his time. And the fact that he behaves in the way he does in all but one of these meetings says something really remarkable. And I want to recapture that, because we live in a very cynical era, and I'm a very cynical person, and we're all very cynical anymore. But there's just so much cynicism today about someone like Lincoln. And I think he gets a bum rap sometimes, and he is not perfect. I mean, I criticize Lincoln in half of my books. But I think when he does something really noteworthy, it needs to be captured and understood. And so I think I try to kind of capture both those things, the humanity of the man and the people he's meeting, and something that's different and I would say great about him as a presidential figure at a very difficult time.
Thanks. I'll just say again, I think you do a fabulous job of that, and I'm not just saying that because we've invited you and I'm being polite. It's a really compelling book.
Thank you.
And
I appreciate that.
I think the fact that you don't shy away from the complicated part of the story, and you just tell story after, provide evidence after more and more evidence, story after story of these other kinds of interactions, really makes your argument that one meeting is the exception that proves the rule really credible. So yeah. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to open up for questions now, and those will either come through Joan, or Joan will invite you to ask your question.
Yeah, we have some questions coming into the chat already. If you have a question you've been sitting on, please feel free to drop it into the chat. You can also click the raise hand button and I'll be able to see that on my end. But the first question we have comes from Kirsten, who is curious about how Lincoln's experience attending the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and especially the pastor after Willie's death, had any effect on his thinking about emancipation.
It's a great question. So Lincoln was close with Phineas Gurney, the pastor at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. And of course, I imagine most of you are in DC. You can go visit the building, although it's not the original one. It was reconstructed in the 20th century. And I think it's a little bit bigger than it was in Lincoln's era. I think that again, I think Lincoln had something of a religious, I don't want to call it conversion, but some sort of religious experience during the course of the war. I think the death of his son, Willie, did play a really important role in his thinking about that. You know, one of the people who was present in the room when Willie died, or right after Willie died, was Elizabeth Keckley, who was the Black seamstress who was close with Mary Lincoln. And she records Lincoln's grief in her book between 30 years. I'm blanking on the title right now, but she records what it was like to see Lincoln grieving. And I don't know that Willie's death had an impact on Lincoln's view of emancipation, but I can say this. So I mentioned earlier that in May of 1861, Lincoln charges his cabinet, his Secretary of the Interior to be specific, with killing off the transatlantic slave trade. And in 1860, a slave trader named Nathaniel Gordon was captured off the western coast of Africa with something like 950 or 960 Africans on board his ship. And Gordon was captured and taken to New York City to be tried for piracy, because under the law of 1820, it was piracy to engage in the transatlantic slave trade. And the Buchanan administration went after Gordon, and it ended up in a hung jury. And then Lincoln became president, and Lincoln goes after him. And it winds up with Gordon getting convicted. And Gordon was sentenced to be executed in February of 1862. So right at this very same moment where Gordon is about to be executed, Willie Lincoln is dying. And Gordon's wife comes to the White House to plead for her husband's life, and Lincoln refuses to meet with her. And thousands and thousands and thousands of signatures pour into the White House calling for Lincoln to pardon this guy, or not to pardon him, but not to execute him, to commute his sentence to life in prison. And the argument they make is that no one has ever been executed for this crime, so we shouldn't do it now because he didn't see it coming. And Lincoln refuses to accept that. And he's grappling with, what do I do about this man's life, at the very same moment that he's about to lose his son, and does lose his son. And Lincoln ends up writing a 2-week stay of execution. He gives Nathaniel Gordon 2 weeks from the scheduled execution until when it happens, because he wants Gordon to have time to prepare for what Lincoln calls that awful change, which is about to come to him. In other words, you're about to meet your maker. You kidnapped almost 1,000 people, most of whom, by the way, were women and children. And you better get right with God before you go there. And so I don't know if there's I thought of this because with the question of Willie's death, I don't know if there's a direct connection in Lincoln losing his son to thinking about the afterlife and how he deals with Nathaniel Gordon. But Lincoln follows through to make sure that Gordon is executed. And incidentally, Gordon tried to kill himself the night before the execution. He drank poison, and the guards found him, and they pumped his stomach to make sure he survived so that he could be hanged the next day. And the first and only person executed for slave trading was done under Lincoln's watch.
That's an incredible story. We also have a question from Teresa about, I think, one of the most famous African-American visitors to the White House, about how many times did Frederick Douglass visit Lincoln there?
Yeah, so Frederick Douglass visited Lincoln 3 times. First time is August of 1863. Lincoln is, managing the war. He has now allowed Black men to join the army, but they are not paid the same pay as white soldiers. And the Confederates have said that they will either enslave or murder any Black soldiers captured on the battlefield. And so Frederick Douglass is really angry about this. He has been recruiting Black soldiers. His sons have joined the 54th Massachusetts, and they're getting paid $7 a month when they were expecting $13. And if they get captured on the battlefield, they could be killed or sold into bondage. So August of 1863, he goes and meets with Lincoln at the White House and pushes Lincoln on these issues. And Lincoln gives him some answers, and Douglas is not fully satisfied with them, but Douglas walks away from this meeting having a new appreciation for the pressures on the president and also the graciousness of Lincoln as a host to a Black man at the White House. And Douglas tells an audience shortly after this meeting, he said, "I felt big there." And he said, "You might want to know how the president of the United States welcomed me into the White House." And he said, "Just as one gentleman would welcome another." The more remarkable meeting happens between Lincoln and Douglas in August of 1864. At this point, Lincoln is convinced he's going to lose re-election. And he knows that if he loses to a Democrat, whoever beats him is going to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. And so this time, Lincoln sends word and invites Frederick Douglass to the White House. And Douglass comes, and the two men sit down together, and Lincoln says, "Douglas, I hate slavery as much as you do." He says, "The slaves aren't running away as fast as I had hoped. I had hoped more would come in after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation." And he essentially says to Douglas, "We need to come up with a plan to free as many slaves as possible before I'm out of office, because once I'm out of office, this golden opportunity will be gone." And Douglas comes up with a plan. They will send bands of scouts into the Confederacy, basically shouting, "Run away now while you can, because March 4th, 1865, there's going to be a new president, and he's not going to offer freedom." Now, fortunately, things took a turn for the better. The war effort went from being very bad in the summer of 1864 to Sherman capturing Atlanta in September and other Union victories, so that Lincoln sailed to a very strong victory in November of 1864. But this meeting is really important. I was talking to someone yesterday who said Lincoln didn't really care about freeing the slaves. He only did it to increase his own power. And I told this story, and here's why this story is important. When we think about emancipation, we often think, well, Lincoln did it as a military necessity. He did it because it was indispensable to saving the Union. He didn't do it out of a moral conviction. He did it for the war. But if you think about Lincoln taking this action at this point in the war, freeing the slaves in this way had nothing to do with military necessity. It had nothing to do with saving the Union. It had everything to do with making slavery as broad and as permanent as possible. And Douglas recognized that in that moment and said that he saw in Lincoln a passion for freedom that he had never seen before. And then the third and final meeting was at the White House after the inauguration on March 4th, 1865. They have a big reception. Douglas goes with another African-American woman. The guards won't let him in. Finally, the guards say, "Okay, you can come in." And they start ushering him through the building, and they've turned a window into an exit so that they can kind of have crowd control. And Douglas realizes that they're just going to pass him right through and kick him out. And Douglas sees someone that he knows, and he says, "Tell the president Frederick Douglass is here." And the president comes over, and Lincoln says, "There's my friend Douglass." And he asks Douglass what he thought of the inaugural address. And Douglass says, "Oh, my opinion doesn't matter." And Lincoln says, "There's no one whose opinion I'd rather know." And Douglass compares it to the Sermon on the Mount, says it wasn't a state paper, it was a sacred effort. And Douglass was just so thrilled by this interaction with Lincoln. They could have met again. Lincoln invited Douglass to tea shortly after that. And Douglass had a policy of if he had a speaking engagement, he would never pull out of it once he had committed. And so, not knowing that the assassination was coming, Douglass turned down Lincoln for tea. And then a month later, Lincoln is killed. And Douglass later said that if he had known that that would have been his last chance, he would have gladly turned down a speaking gig to have met with Lincoln a fourth time.
So while we don't have a ton of time for additional questions, there are a couple other things happening in the chat that I want to make people aware of. One of which is that there are links to both to get the book, if you have enjoyed the conversation and want to know more about all of these rich stories Jonathan has been sharing with us. There's a link to get the book in the chat. There's also a link, thanks to Michelle Crowell at the Library of Congress, to the original letter from Lincoln's Haitian friend to him, if you would like to check that out as far as primary sources go. And there is also an analogy from Charlie about that, letting us know that your description of Lincoln shaking hands with folks, John, reminded him of Princess Diana shaking hands with folks who were experiencing AIDS. Just so I think, again, you've painted this picture of a really human version of Lincoln, the president. It's one of the things that's exciting about it. But Michael, I want to turn it over to you. So we're respecting folks' time in their exciting evening.
I think you're muted, Michael.
Better now?
Yeah.
I was just saying 2.5 years into a pandemic and I'm still struggling with unmuting myself. It's just so exciting to be able to talk to you and hear the breadth of your knowledge and the depth of your passion for the subject, a subject which obviously brings all of us together at President Lincoln's Cottage. Thanks again to our board members, our donors, and our members who make the work of the Cottage possible. We really are a home for brave ideas, and we welcome all of you anytime you want to come, of course. Reach out, let us know what you're thinking about, give us your ideas for programming, and stay in touch. Thanks one and all, and thank you again, John.
Thank you.